Miss Jody here with another video for the history of medicine. Sorry, I realized I forgot to do the history of medicine last week. I did all the other classes and I don't know how I forgot that one, but I did. So that's why you did not have a video for last week. So this is actually last week's lesson, but what can you do, right? So hopefully we'll just keep trucking along here. So speaking of trucking along, we are coming towards the end here of our school year. So we have a couple more chapters left. One, two, let's see, three, four. Okay, so four left after this one. So we're almost done. And hopefully you're keeping up with the notes. Don't forget to be doing your notes on a half sheet of paper, and that way I can glue them in. Now, this particular one today with Mysterious Rays, it only has notes half the way down, which still you'd still have to do on a half sheet of paper, but there's also part of the diagram that I'm sending you. The diagrams are going to be cut into smaller pieces for different pages to go along with the lessons. So some of the notes can be on this one around the crux too. All right, so moving along, we are studying today the discovery of the X-ray and how that applies to the medical world. So this particular title of the chapter, Mysterious Rays. All right, so I'll be hopping back and forth between this page and the next one, which will actually be of the scientist William Crook. So in 1850, scientists discovered that electricity can travel through a vacuum even without a conductor. So in the traditional situations of electricity, you probably know the old electrical, when you're doing an electric circuit or something. I'll just do this as a resistor here. Okay, so the drawing's like this. This would be the negative side, and this would be your positive side of that would be where your battery is. But you would need something in order to get the electricity to work. You need something for the electrons to move along, like the wire, the conductor, and of course this little squiggly is a resistor when you're drawing a circuit, which could be a light bulb or whatever. But it would need something to move along to get to the positive side. And so the traditional ways with electricity and creating circuits and getting movement, you needed a wire to go in between the two so that it could travel along, and then the connection could work. And they started realizing that if you had the positive and the negative separated, and you applied voltage, high voltage, so applied to two wires placed several centimeters apart. So instead of the traditional looking thing like that, they would have a cathode, which is a negative side. So here, like, let's just say I'm going to seal this off, and actually I'll seal it off in a better looking tube, which would be more like what became known as the light bulbs. So say I have in this tube and I sealed it off, and I had one end over here which had the negative charge, and then this one which had the positive charge. Instead of them actually having to touch, so I'll put the negative charge over here and the positive charge over here, without them actually having to have a wire to touch the two. If this was done in a vacuum, then with enough voltage, the negative side could jump over in this area with no air and reach the other side, and the circuits could still be formed without that wire in between, so no conductor. So they discovered that the electricity can travel through the vacuum even without a conductor, without something allowing a pathway. And so when they were creating these vacuum tubes, they would have high voltage applied to the two wires, so really high voltage, and it would jump across. And the negative side is called the cathode, and the positive side is called the anode. And so over time, these tubes began to be really popular and used for many things, and that's where the X-ray discovery of the X-ray comes in. But the gentleman William Crookes, who created this sealing off and understanding what's going on with the electricity by adding really high voltage, created what's known as the actual Crookes tube, which is a bigger version than just a regular vacuum tube. So I'm just gonna hop over here for a quick second, and this would be on a different note page, some information about him. Or maybe since both of these are small ones, you could take one note sheet and do half of it for the mysterious rays and half of it for the Williams Crook, and then I can just cut them and glue them on each side, because that's what's happening with the little diagrams. This is just some information on William Crook. Born June 17th, 1832 in London. He was a British chemist and physicist. He worked on spectroscopy, and that's where you study the light world. So lots of trying to look at the different waves of light and be able to use those as kind of barcodes to particular elements. And he was the pioneer of the vacuum tube, what I just talked to you about, inventing the Crookes tube, which is sometimes referred to as CR2, the cathode ray tube, in 1875. Some people say 1878, so I'm not sure which one would be perfectly correct, but somewhere around that time. Thomas Edison actually learned how to make the glass globes for his light bulbs from Crookes' experiments, and so Crook had a good influence on the rise of the lighting times in the time of Edison and Tesla and the artificial lighting. Other scientists also filled these Crookes tubes with different gases and did many more experiments. And I'm going to show you how the Crookes tube works here in a second. But another thing with William Crook, and this is just something that's going to be glued on, he did a lot of scientific discoveries and had a lot of scientific endeavors. But one thing, thallium, you can't see it because my thing printed out really dark, my copier today for some reason, but thallium, he discovered the element thallium. This is a radiometer, that's how you say it. And that's something, actually I have one right here, if you've ever seen this little doodazzy that you put out in the light and it starts to spin when you give it the light or whatever. Of course, it's going to be, I have a light right here, but if I'm touching it, it's shaking it. So you have to let it sit by itself for a while and get still, and then when you put it in the presence of the light, it does its little spinning. And so he's the creator of that with the paddles, and I can just draw this up here so you can remember that, what it looks like there. I'll link a little video on how this works, and even though he didn't fully understand how it worked when he created it, and why he was kind of creating it, but that way you remember what that looks like. So it wasn't just the Crookes tube, but his Crookes tube was very important, and specifically to the history of medicine, because that's what was used to create the first X-rays. All right, so William Crookes, he begins and creates these specific tubes, and building then was built on many applications of this for creating tons of types of vacuum tubes. All right, so Crookes tubes designed so that the streams of electrons, now at the time they didn't know this was electrons, but now we know this is a stream of electrons, would miss the anode and strike the end of the glass tube instead, which was coated with a phosphor, which a phosphor is a material. Let me see if I can kind of illustrate it with the darker green here. But the phosphor material that it was coated with was a material that would have a phosphorescent, well, really more of a fluorescent, but yeah, somewhat phosphorescent, I guess, effect, which means that it would glow in the presence of, usually it was the UV light, and so this material down here basically was just helping them see these rays as they were created. And so, like I was saying up here with the vacuum tubes, if you got enough high voltage, it will eventually make a spark across the gap without the wire. So if I put a little spark across the gap without the wire, and the reason they seal it in the vacuum is so that a lot of times, if you look at light bulb, the making of light bulbs, they put them in vacuums because when they were creating the light bulbs, and even the ones that actually had a wire in between it. The wire in between it would be called a filament. So when they use this design to actually create the filament or the regular incandescent light bulbs, they did have a conductor that, or whatever that it went through, not necessarily a conductor, but a filament. And it would get so hot from the flow of the electricity through that it would shine white. It would burn, yellowish and white and whatever's, depending on how hot it got. And so you can recognize that design in the light bulb. And so with this, during this time when they had the jumping, when they were creating just the vacuum ones, not the light bulb ones, but the jumping across, when this tube was created to be able to really visualize where the rays were going and to study them and to figure out what they were, it was designed in this way so that the cathode here, which would be the negative side, is going to have like a little cord or whatever, because these two have to be hooked up in the anode, have to be hooked up to the high-powered voltage. And what that was back in the day is they had already discovered this ability to induce a current. Now, inducing a current is you make electricity flow through something, and how they did it is they had the alternating current, they had the back and forth of the magnetic field that was creating the current, and as it went back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth, and it would flow through a wire, going from one side to the other on a electric inductor, I mean. And what they would do is be able to create a second coil, because you would do your first coil as it would be flowing through it, and then a second coil, and that second coil, and I'll just draw it over here, this isn't where it would be or whatever, but a second coil, if it had more turns in it, then you could have a lower voltage, let's say, and then you have it with the second coil that it would come in contact with, and it would force this coil that had more turns in it to create a higher flow, which a higher voltage, I should say, not higher flow, but a higher voltage. And the voltage is kind of like the push behind the electricity, the like power. Think of it like a hose. There always illustrates voltage like a hose. So if you have a hose and you just let the water come out, but if you put your finger on the end of the hose, it makes it shoot out really, really hard. And that's because you're causing a difference in the pressure there to kind of allow only a certain amount to flow out, and so it builds up this whole big amount on the other side of it, which is really like forcing and wanting so bad to get out. So it's an indifference, or it's a difference between how much is pushed in the back and then how much can get out, and that creates a voltage. And same thing with electricity. We can have a voltage with the inducing the current, it can be created to be higher or even lower, and that's how we get our electricity to be so high powered whenever we're using electricity. Our electricity is created, and then we want it to travel along those real big high wires. They step up the voltage by using these coils where they have more turns in them, and more turns makes it more pressurized as it's trying to get through all those coils. And so it's like the hose kind of holding back, and it gets so pressurized, and then it flows really, really fast and really, really hard. But then when it's coming to our house, you got to do the opposite. You got to have it be ready to be in near a coil that's smaller, so it can step down the voltage before it comes into your house, because it'd be too powerful to come into your house at that high voltage. And so we have the step down or step up transformers, and then we have the step down transformers with electricity. So they were starting to figure this out back in the day, and so they were making these induction coils, and these induction coils, they knew how to figure out how much voltage, or they could change them into the voltages they wanted. So 1,000 volts and 5,000 volts. And Crook was able to make an induction coil that was 25,000 volts. So that was pretty powerful for back in the day. And so what would happen is as the electricity was moving through, and you see how it's kind of designed where this anode is down here a little bit farther. So it's designed to where it's not directly. Some of the crooks or some of the tubes where you'd have your cathode here and your anode here, and it would just jump, the spark would just go across. But this one was kind of, and the spark is trying to go in a straight line. So in a sense, if it's really, really powered, it's going to kind of fly past that and not reach fully, not everything's going to reach fully here. And so how this design worked is it made it to where the discharge was coming out so fast that it would just fly, so some of it would hit the back of the tube. And with that phosphor there, you were able to see like where the rays were landing. And what would happen is they were so high powered that it made this greenish glow because that phosphor would glow, and you could track it. And I'll send you a video on some cathode or some Crookes tubes now, or cathode ray tubes, and you can see how when they're used in science classes and stuff, you can see the green light. Usually they put like a piece of white behind it so you can see the stream of the ray, and they put the high power voltage on it. Now, what was interesting is when he worked with this one is that he didn't know what it was. This one, it says that it was a stream of high-speed electrons. They didn't know it was electrons then, and he didn't know what it was. He thought maybe it was light. But see, he took magnets, and the magnets would like move the rays. And so he was like, well, it can't really be, because regular light wasn't being moved. So he thought at first it was light, and then he was like, well, is it really light, or is it particles, or what it is? Because the magnet can actually move the whole stream. And I'll send a video for you to see that live so you can visualize that. And so magnets bent the path of as did metal plates charged with static electricity. So they experimented with different things, like putting things in there, and like as the rays went through, was this particular material able to stop it? Or they'd put something that was charged up with static electricity, and what would that do? Would that change the beam like the magnets change the beam? And that's not what they saw normally when they were studying light. So they thought, this has to be something different. What is this? And it makes sense to us because we understand how electricity works now. And we understand that it's the electrons, and they're going, moving toward the positive and balancing out there. But because they're so high powered and so much voltage, it was so high speed, it was like past the and being boom, 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 bombarding the end of the tube. And you could see sometimes when they couldn't go through the particular metal or whatever, you'd see this shadow on the end of the tube. It's hard to see on my bad printout here. And so Crookes tube doesn't sound like it has a lot of application to the study of medicine, but it really did, because it was a lot that they were experimenting with, and many scientists had Crookes tubes and were experimenting with all different things with high voltage, and they would fill it with gases, with all different kinds of gases, and experiment with it and try to figure out what it was. But in the end, it comes down to William Röntgen, and Röntgen is mainly he's a German, but his mother was a Dutch, so he actually grew up in the Netherlands, but he's said to be a German mechanical engineer and physicist. And so he was really fascinated with a lot of these things and used Crookes tube. And you can see the time frame. This is when he starts figuring the X-ray out in 1895, and Crookes when was he made this? In 1850 they were doing the vacuum tubes, and Crookes was part of that first vacuum tube world. I'm not exactly sure. 1875 they say is this actual Crookes tube. So 1875, and then in 1895, so this is about 20 years later. So Crookes tube is already a big piece in the scientific world, and lots of studies were being done. So in this gentleman, so on November 8th, 1895, while working late in the afternoon, which it had already gotten dark by then, Röntgen experimented with the Crookes tube. So he was doing some experiments for the Crookes tube, and it had already gotten dark. And because it was dark, and he was, first, before he was wanting to know is how far did the cathode rays, and again, they called them the cathode rays because they came from the cathode. And so the Crookes tube, whenever you hear cathode rays, these rays coming from the cathode, what were they? They were trying to figure out all this stuff. And he wondered how far they traveled after they struck the walls of the glass tube. Like, did they come out? Some scientists at the time thought they went past the glass tube, and some didn't think that. And it wasn't really showing that there was, I mean, like you could put a piece of paper in between the green rays sometimes and stop them. And so they were thinking, you know, is anything getting out beyond that? And so he was questioning that. And so he was doing some experiments, and he realized, because it was dark, that there was a glow from across the room, and it caught his eye. And here it was, these crystals that he left over from a different experiment, and these crystals were emanating this light. They were glowing. And he thought that was so strange, and so he turned off the Crookes tube, and the glow went away. He turned it back on, and the glow came back. And so he took a piece of cardboard and he painted it with those very types of crystals that would glow, and they're probably a crushed version of it, and the cardboard glue. And then he turned the Crookes tube off, and it would not, and then he'd turn it back on, and so he started doing all these experiments, and he realized that the rays, even though, now when I'm saying that the crystals glue and stuff, the green ray of the tube it wasn't like it was continuing out and you saw the stream going on, because it wasn't. It was still contained. It was something outside of this, these invisible rays that were coming from the running of the Crookes tube, but it wasn't like these green rays continuing on to the other side of the room and you could see it like a laser or something. It wasn't like that. They were emanating out from this, but they were invisible, and they were glowing. They were making these crystals glow. And so he started experimenting with these rays that were not the green ones, they were the invisible ones. And he took thick pieces of wood, and he realized the rays still passed through them and the crystal still glowed. These invisible rays went through glass, and that didn't stop them, and the crystals still grow. And he coated a piece of paper with the crystals, and even he put it in the other room. And so even in the other room, the paper was still glowing. So you can imagine the day, because, you know, them not understanding all this, it makes sense to us, but back in the day, could you imagine that paper still glowing in another room? And even when he closed the door. And so he knew he was onto something, that when that Crookes tube was running, something else was being created that came out of the tube. You just couldn't see it. And the only way you could see it is if it was lighting something up that had that phosphorescence property, like the particular crystals that he had painted on the papers. So, and nothing was stopping it. So if you put a piece of wood in front of it, they still got through. If you put, the glass, it still got through. So he said, here's these invisible rays, and there's something about them. Not only can you not see them, but they can go through things. And he knew it wasn't the cathode rays, the actual cathode rays themselves, the green rays, or the rays that were inside the tube. He knew they had to be at new waves, because they were not coming directly from that tube, and they, like I said, were in the other room, and even with the door closed. And so he knew they had to be some new ray that was being created by the machine. And of course, he ended up calling them X-rays, because he didn't know what they were. So back in the day, you use the letter X for, like, a mystery, unknown, like in algebra. And so he called them X-rays, like these are these ones we don't know, these mysterious rays. And he realized that these particular rays were not affected by the magnets, like in the original experiments, where the magnet could move the green line or the rays inside the tube. That wasn't happening with these new rays that he was figuring out that were in the room and all over the place. And then one day, as he was experimenting, he noticed a shadow when his hand was in front of the tube, in between the tube and something else. He noticed a shadow of his thumb. And not only was it just the outline of his thumb, he could see the shadow of his bone inside. And that was just like amazing, because he was thinking, I can't believe these rays, not only do they go through wood and glass, but they actually can go through the body. And so he's famous for the experiment, or for taking the Crookes tube and creating basically the first X-ray machine. It's said in that same year, sometime in that same year, not that same day, but sometime in that same year, in 1895, his wife Emma, he had her, and what, if you could see on this particular diagram, see how the Crookes tube is pointed down compared to the one that was in the original one that was side by side. And so you would say, like, if I was drawing the same like green lines or whatever here, or the green glow there, and on the back there. And so but these invisible rays that were happening out here that nobody could really see and didn't know what they were the actual X-rays. So as he realized that these rays could go through the body, then he had an idea to take the photographic film and wrap it in black paper, and then have his wife lay her hand on it and then put it underneath the Crookes tube. And then it had to sit there for like 15 minutes because it took a while, for these were, not super high powered in the sense of the ones that we create now with our X-ray machines. And so, you go in there to get X-rayed now and it takes 2 seconds. They shoot a beam at you and it's very, or they shoot, they power that voltage up and boom. But back in the day, it took a while. And so the photographic paper was in that black, or the photographic film was wrapped in that black paper, and she set her hand there, and then after a while, after 15 minutes or whatever, and then there was, once that was shown, it was her hand, and this was her famous one, and they say that was where her ring was at the time. And so this being, and you can see here, this is a better drawing of an induction coil here. So this is the back and forth of part of the alternating current, and then this would have been the coil that would make it really high powered, and then it would be at the cathode here, and the anode down here. It's just a Crookes tube sideways, and then the way the rays that were coming out, the invisible rays, would be right in the presence of the hand and be able to create the picture. So in December 22nd of 1895, so he started in November when he was first working with it. So, a little over a month later, almost, a month and a half later, he finally announced his discovery. And of course, at first it was something that was like not really thought to possibly be true. No one had seen something like that before. But then in January 23rd of 1896, so a month later, because this was at the end of December, so about a month later, he was given the opportunity to actually just show this at the Physical Medicine Society of Würzburg, and he did a talk on this and explained it, and then he gave a demonstration, and an older gentleman was able to come up and get his hand x-rayed, and he was able to show that it was true. And of course some people were just ecstatic, but some people were just freaked out about it all, and you can imagine. He did end up winning the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903 for the discovery of the X-ray. Now, the X-ray we know is used so much in medicine, but the problem was the popularity of the X-ray without knowing the dangers back then was really sad, because, and these are just a couple that come with your printout, but you don't have to waste your ink printing them out. I can print them here at the Science Center and glue them in your book, but I just wanted you to have them so you could see it. This particular diagram is showing obviously the x-raying of the hand there with the Crookes tube, but even the toys that were created once this became a hot number. In fact, people right away were working with their Crookes tubes trying to create the x-rays and all that. This one, you looked in it with your eyes through, and then the hand right there with the Crookes tube, and you were basically inundating your eyes with radiation, and they just didn't know it back then. So obviously eventually these were banned once they started figuring out that this was not a good idea to constantly be having radiation exposure. Even the shoes back then, I can't remember if this was around the 1930s. I forget exactly when this was that they were still doing this, and they finally banned it. But you can kind of tell, it's hard with this diagram, but this is like a little thing that you would get up on, and you'd put your feet in there, and it would take x-rays. This was at the shoe stores. It would take x-rays of your feet in the shoes just to show they fit. And so people loved it. And this was an advertisement back then. X-ray fitting, customers expect it. These little x-ray machines. And they'd be in every shoe store. You can go in and, you know, because you're a kid, you're always like, push down on your big toe. Let me see you. Does it fit? Does it fit? You just use the x-ray to see if the shoe fits. And of course, this is way before any understanding of radiation poisoning. And there did come a time when they started realizing this. You could even go to carnivals and you could get your skeleton x-rayed using this technology, and just a bunch of fun. You could do all kinds of things that seemed really fun and great in the day, and just not realizing how dangerous it was. But it does say in our book about the time when they started realizing that there was a lot of dangers with these x-rays, and people were getting x-ray poisoning. Thomas Edison, he was one. His assistant, no, he wasn't the one who got the x-ray, but one of his assistants had come down with the x-ray poisoning, and his hair fell out, it says, and his scalp became covered with sores. And eventually they started realizing that people were getting all these radiation burns for overexposure to x-rays. And, you know, it's just like anything when it comes to the x-ray world. You don't really realize this, but anytime, like say our living cells, like my hand here, my cell can only handle a certain amount of energy transfer at once. And so even if I put this in boiling hot water, the reason I get burnt is because my cells, all that energy, because the change in the temperature between the hot water in my hand, because of the law of thermodynamics, the warm water has to move to my hand because isn't as warm. So the water that's energized has to move to my hand that's lacking energy because of that law. And so it'll just go boom, 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 and start hitting all my cells, right? Because it's trying to transfer to even out, but it's too much at once. And so that's what happens with radiation. It's fine if you have a small amount and it's not a very high powered, not as high frequency and like a longer wavelength type of energy transfer. But if you have something where you're getting inundated frequently, like boom, 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 with high energy transfer, that's going to be a bad problem. And so the radiation burns from that, and of course that kills cells because they can only handle so much. And then you can only have exposure to x-rays, a small amount, and we know that now. And of course the cancer, all of it. I mean, it's something we didn't know back then, and now we do. The sad part is, when I was reading one of the things, it said that his wife actually died from radiation sarcoma death. So probably in helping him with some of his experiments, it would be my guess. And we know even with Marie Curie and some of the other ones that worked with radioactive elements, I mean, the list goes on. Until they figured it out, they were like, oh, this is fun. Let's just look at your hand, and let's look at your feet, and let's x-ray all the children's feet and in their hands at the carnival. Yeah. So, well, now we know, right? So that's the end of the first part on the x-ray, and then our next chapter continues on of the usefulness of the radiation in looking at Henry Becquerel and Pierre Curie, which was Marie Curie's husband, and Marie Curie. And so we'll look at that in our next chapter.